Your soulmate had something to say about your style. Stay until the end. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the end, because what you're about to hear isn't about expensive clothes, perfect trends, or trying to impress the world. It's about the moment someone looked beyond the surface and discovered something they couldn't explain. Imagine this as a fictional story, one that explores the quiet emotions two hearts can carry without ever speaking them aloud. Sometimes the smallest details become the ones we remember forever, and sometimes a single glance changes everything before either person realizes it has happened. There was a moment when your paths crossed, and it lasted only a few seconds. The room was filled with ordinary conversations, soft laughter, and people moving from one place to another, yet one person seemed to forget all of that. Their attention settled on you. It wasn't because you looked like everyone else. It wasn't because you were trying to stand out. It was because your style carried something that couldn't be purchased, copied, or explained. It reflected pieces of your personality that spoke long before your voice ever could. Later that evening, long after everyone else had gone home, they found themselves replaying that memory again and again. They remembered the colors you wore, the way you carried yourself, and the confidence hidden beneath your quiet expressions. They whispered to themselves, there was something different about them. They couldn't understand why such a simple image stayed with them, yet it refused to disappear. Every attempt to focus on something else only brought your memory back into their thoughts. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. It wasn't really your outfit that captured their attention. It was the feeling they experienced while looking at you. Your appearance reminded them of someone who wasn't pretending to be anyone else. In a world where so many people chase approval, they saw someone who seemed comfortable being authentic. That realization unsettled them more than they expected, because authenticity has a way of exposing the walls we build around our own hearts. Days passed, but the memory refused to fade. They caught themselves comparing everyone they met to that single unforgettable impression. New faces came and went, conversations started and ended, yet something always felt incomplete. They began wondering whether they had missed an opportunity to know someone extraordinary. The question echoed in their mind every night until sleep became difficult to find. Then came the conversation they never planned to have. A close friend noticed their distraction and asked what had been occupying their thoughts. At first they laughed it off, insisting it was nothing important, but silence has a strange habit of revealing the truth. Finally they admitted that they couldn't stop thinking about someone whose style reflected kindness instead of pride, confidence instead of arrogance, and quiet strength instead of the need for constant attention. Saying those words out loud surprised even them. Something huge is waiting for you in this story, because that confession became the beginning of an emotional awakening they never expected. They realized they hadn't been admiring fashion at all. They had been searching for the person behind it. Every detail they remembered was connected to the feeling of meeting someone genuine, someone who reminded them that the most attractive quality isn't perfection, it's honesty expressed without words. From that night forward, they started noticing little things they had ignored before. They wondered what made you smile when no one was watching. They imagined the music you might listen to during quiet evenings, the dreams you carried in your heart, and the struggles you never spoke about. Curiosity slowly transformed into admiration, and admiration quietly grew into something much deeper. What began as a passing observation had become an unforgettable story inside their heart. Stay until the end, because the greatest realization had not happened yet. One evening they stood in front of a mirror, thinking about everything they had admired in you. Suddenly they understood that your style wasn't teaching them how to dress, it was reminding them how to be themselves. They had spent years trying to become the version of themselves they believed everyone wanted, while you inspired them to believe that authenticity could be enough. That single realization changed the way they looked at their own life. And somewhere beyond all the noise, beyond every doubt and every unanswered question, they silently hoped that one day your paths would cross again. Not so they could compliment your appearance, but so they could finally tell you the truth, that the most unforgettable thing about your style was never the clothes you wore. It was the courage to let your true self shine through them, and that quiet courage inspired someone else to begin changing their own life. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay with this story, because what happened next transformed a quiet admiration into something neither of them could have predicted. Days turned into weeks, yet the memory remained untouched by time. Every morning began with ordinary routines, but somewhere in the background of their thoughts, your image continued to appear with surprising clarity. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, persistent, and impossible to ignore, like a melody that quietly follows someone throughout the day. They tried convincing themselves it was just curiosity, but the heart has a way of recognizing moments the mind struggles to explain. One rainy evening, they opened their closet, searching for something to wear before meeting friends. They reached for the same familiar clothes they had always chosen, then suddenly stopped. For the first time, they asked themselves a question that had never crossed their mind before. Am I dressing to hide who I am, or am I dressing to express who I am? The silence that followed felt heavier than expected. It wasn't really about fashion anymore. It was about identity, confidence, and the parts of themselves they had kept hidden for years. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. As they stood in front of the mirror, they remembered the quiet confidence they imagined seeing in you. Not confidence that demanded attention, but the kind that existed without needing anyone's approval. That memory encouraged them to try something different. They chose colors they had always loved but rarely wore. They smiled at their own reflection, not because they looked perfect, but because they finally looked honest. For the first time in a long while, the person staring back at them felt familiar. That single decision began creating changes far beyond appearance. Friends noticed they seemed more relaxed, more open, more willing to laugh without pretending everything was fine. Conversations became deeper. Smiles became genuine. They realized they had spent years protecting themselves behind invisible walls, believing vulnerability was weakness. Yet the image of someone who appeared comfortable simply being themselves challenged everything they once believed. Something huge is waiting in this story. Late one night, while scrolling through old photographs, they paused on pictures taken years earlier. They noticed a younger version of themselves smiling freely before fear, disappointment, and heartbreak had slowly changed the way they faced the world. They whispered softly, "I miss that person." In that quiet room, surrounded by memories, they understood that your presence, real or imagined in their thoughts, had awakened something they thought was gone forever. From that night onward, they began paying attention to the smallest moments. They noticed sunsets they had once ignored. They lingered over conversations instead of rushing through them. They started complimenting strangers, calling old friends, and showing kindness without expecting anything in return. It surprised them how one meaningful impression could ripple through so many parts of life. They weren't becoming someone new. They were rediscovering someone they had forgotten. Stay till the end, because the story was quietly leading toward another unexpected turn. One afternoon, while walking through a familiar neighborhood, they spotted someone in the distance wearing colors that reminded them of you. Their hearts skipped for a moment before they realized it wasn't the same person. Instead of disappointment, they smiled. The memory no longer brought longing alone. It brought gratitude. Whoever had inspired those feelings had unknowingly become the beginning of their own healing. Yet one question refused to leave them. What if they had the chance to meet the person who inspired all of this? Would they have the courage to speak honestly? Would they simply say, "I like your style," or would they reveal the deeper truth, that seeing someone live authentically had changed the way they looked at themselves? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing was becoming impossible to deny. Some encounters last only minutes, yet their influence can echo for years. As the evening sky slowly darkened, they found themselves looking upward with a quiet sense of hope. Not because they expected destiny to solve every problem, but because they had learned that meaningful connections often begin with the smallest moments. A glance. A smile. A quiet observation that grows into something far greater than anyone expects. They took a deep breath and whispered into the night, "If our paths ever cross again, I'll finally tell the truth." Little did they know, somewhere beyond that same evening horizon, another chapter was already beginning, one that neither of them could have imagined. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because the next part of this story reveals a truth that had been quietly growing beneath the surface all along. As the days continued to pass, they began noticing something unexpected. Every place they visited seemed to remind them of you in some small way. A stranger wearing a familiar color, a song playing softly in a cafe, even the reflection of city lights in a rainy street somehow carried echoes of that unforgettable first impression. They knew these were ordinary moments, yet their heart insisted they meant something more. The memories were no longer random, they had become part of the rhythm of everyday life. One evening, while sitting alone near a window watching the sunset disappear behind distant buildings, they found themselves smiling without realizing it. It wasn't because they believed everything would magically fall into place. It was because they had finally accepted that some people arrive in our lives long before we truly meet them. Sometimes they appear as inspiration, sometimes as unanswered questions, and sometimes as a quiet reminder that hope still exists. They wondered if you had ever experienced that same mysterious feeling, the sense that someone you've barely spoken to has somehow changed the direction of your thoughts forever. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. That night they made a decision they had avoided for years. They promised themselves they would stop hiding behind fear. Every disappointment from the past had convinced them that opening their heart only invited pain, but your quiet influence had slowly dismantled those walls one memory at a time. They realized courage doesn't arrive all at once. It grows through countless small decisions to believe again, even after life has given every reason not to. As the weeks unfolded, people around them began asking why they seemed different. Their smile had become softer, their eyes brighter, and their conversations more genuine. No one knew the real reason. They simply answered, "I've been thinking about someone who reminded me who I used to be." Those words sounded simple, yet they carried the weight of emotions they still couldn't fully explain. Deep inside, they hoped the universe would somehow allow unfinished stories to find their proper ending. Something huge is waiting for you in this story. One quiet afternoon they unexpectedly walked past the very place where they had first noticed you. Everything looked almost exactly the same. The familiar sounds filled the air, people moved in every direction, and life continued without knowing it had once witnessed a life-changing moment. They stood still for several seconds, remembering every tiny detail. Their heartbeat quickened, not because they expected you to appear, but because that place reminded them how quickly a single moment can transform an entire future. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of feeling sadness, they felt gratitude. They finally understood that whether your paths crossed again or not, the lesson had already changed them forever. You had unknowingly shown them that authenticity attracts hearts more powerfully than perfection ever could. That realization became the beginning of a completely different chapter in their own life. They started chasing dreams they had postponed, repairing relationships they had neglected, and believing they deserved happiness instead of merely hoping for it. Stay until the end, because the greatest emotional shift was only beginning. Late that night they picked up a notebook that had remained untouched for years. Without thinking too much, they began writing. Every sentence described the person they hoped to meet again someday. They wrote about quiet confidence, gentle kindness, thoughtful eyes, and a style that reflected a beautiful soul instead of chasing attention. As the pages filled, they suddenly realized they weren't writing about fashion anymore. They were writing about character. They were writing about the feeling someone had left inside their heart. Hours passed before they finally closed the notebook. Looking at the final page, they whispered softly, "If we ever meet again, I won't waste the opportunity." It wasn't a promise to another person alone. It was a promise to themselves. No more pretending. No more silence. No more allowing fear to decide the ending of a story that hadn't even reached its most important chapter. As dawn slowly painted the sky with shades of gold, they stepped outside and took a deep breath. The world looked exactly the same, yet everything felt different inside them. They couldn't explain why hope suddenly felt stronger than fear, but it did. Somewhere beyond that sunrise, another heart was unknowingly moving toward its own moment of realization. Neither of them could see it yet, but two separate journeys were quietly beginning to move in the same direction. And what would happen the next time their eyes met would leave both of them speechless, changing everything they thought they knew about love, timing, and the extraordinary power of simply being yourself. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the end, because this chapter uncovers the moment when silence could no longer hide what the heart had been protecting for so long. Days continued to move forward, yet something unusual began happening. Every time they caught their reflection in a mirror, they no longer searched for flaws first. Instead, they remembered the quiet confidence they had associated with you. It was as though the memory of your presence had become a gentle voice reminding them that authenticity leaves a deeper impression than perfection ever could. They smiled to themselves, wondering if somewhere, without realizing it, you were also growing in ways neither of you could yet understand. One afternoon, while walking through a crowded street, they noticed people rushing in every direction, each carrying invisible stories and hidden emotions. It made them wonder how many life-changing moments are missed simply because people are too distracted to truly see one another. That thought brought them back to you. They remembered the first glance, the quiet admiration, and the countless nights spent wondering why one brief encounter had lingered for so long. The memory no longer felt accidental. It felt like the beginning of a story that still had unwritten pages waiting to be discovered. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. That evening they received an unexpected invitation to attend a small gathering hosted by an old friend. Normally they would have declined without hesitation, choosing the comfort of staying home instead. But something inside encouraged them to say yes. They couldn't explain why. It wasn't excitement or certainty. It was simply the quiet feeling that life sometimes rewards those who take one small step beyond their fears. They prepared for the evening with unusual care, not to impress anyone, but because they finally wanted their outward appearance to reflect the confidence they had been slowly rebuilding within themselves. As they entered the room, familiar voices filled the air. Laughter echoed from every corner, music played softly in the background, and conversations blended into a warm atmosphere. Yet despite all the noise, they couldn't shake the strange feeling that something important was about to happen. Their eyes wandered across the room, pausing for only a moment on each unfamiliar face. Their heart remained calm until one instant changed everything. Across the room stood someone whose presence awakened the same unexplainable feeling they had carried for so long. They couldn't be certain from that distance, but every instinct whispered that life had just brought them back to the beginning. Something huge is waiting in this story. They didn't rush forward. Instead, they stood completely still, allowing themselves to breathe through the overwhelming emotions rising inside them. Memories flooded back all at once, the colors they remembered, the quiet confidence, the inspiration that had slowly transformed their life. Whether it was truly you or simply someone who reminded them of you hardly mattered in that first moment. What mattered was realizing they were no longer the frightened person who had walked away in silence before. They had changed, and they were finally ready to face whatever came next. Meanwhile, the other person across the room seemed to pause as well. It was only for a heartbeat, but sometimes a single heartbeat is enough to change the direction of an entire story. Their eyes lifted, scanning the room until they briefly met another gaze. No words were spoken. No introductions were made. Yet the silence between those two strangers carried an unusual sense of familiarity, as though both were trying to remember a dream they had nearly forgotten. The world around them continued without noticing that something extraordinary had just begun. Stay until the end, because the greatest realization had not yet arrived. Instead of looking away, they held that glance for one quiet moment longer. There was no pressure, no dramatic declaration, only a calm recognition that certain connections begin with simple honesty rather than perfect timing. For the first time in years, fear did not win. Their heartbeat remained steady as they took one slow step forward. Then another. Every step felt symbolic, leaving behind old doubts and moving toward a future they had once been too afraid to imagine. Just before they reached the other side of the room, someone unexpectedly called their name. They turned instinctively, smiling as an old friend greeted them warmly. The conversation lasted only a minute, yet when they looked back, the mysterious person had disappeared into the crowd. Their hearts sank for an instant, wondering if the opportunity had slipped away once again. They searched every corner of the room, every hallway, every doorway, but there was no sign of them. It felt as though the moment had vanished as quietly as it had appeared. As the evening came to an end and everyone began saying their goodbyes, they stepped outside beneath a sky filled with stars. Instead of disappointment, they felt an unexpected sense of peace. They had finally learned that some moments are not meant to end a story, they are meant to prepare the next chapter. And just as they started walking home, completely unaware of what was waiting ahead, a gentle voice behind them softly spoke their name. They froze where they stood, slowly turning around, knowing that whatever happened next would become the moment they would remember for the rest of their life. My beloved child, don't skip. Stay until the very end, because every unanswered question, every quiet memory, and every moment of uncertainty has been leading to this final chapter. As they slowly turned toward the gentle voice that had called their name, time seemed to stand still. The noise of the street faded into the distance, and for one unforgettable moment, there was nothing but two people standing face to face, each carrying a story the other had unknowingly helped to write. Neither of them spoke immediately. Sometimes the deepest emotions arrive in silence before they ever become words. The first smile was small, almost hesitant, yet it carried more honesty than 1,000 rehearsed conversations. They laughed softly at how strange life could be. After all the nights spent wondering, imagining, and doubting, the moment they had hoped for arrived in the most ordinary way. There were no dramatic coincidences, no impossible miracles, only two people finally willing to be present instead of hiding behind fear. In that quiet exchange, they realized something beautiful. The strongest connections are not built on perfection, but on authenticity, patience, and the courage to be seen as you truly are. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. They finally gathered the courage to say what had remained locked inside their heart for so long. Do you know what I remembered most about you? They asked with a gentle smile. It wasn't your clothes. It wasn't a trend or a color. It was the confidence to be yourself. Seeing that inspired me to become someone more honest with myself. For a brief moment, silence returned. Then the other person smiled with quiet gratitude, admitting they had never imagined that simply being themselves could encourage someone else's journey. The conversation continued as if they were picking up a story that had paused rather than ended. They spoke about dreams they had postponed, fears they had carried, and the versions of themselves they had spent years trying to become. The more they talked, the more they discovered that what had first seemed like admiration for someone's style had always been admiration for something much deeper, the courage to live with sincerity. They realized they had both been searching for the same thing all along, a place where they could stop pretending and simply be accepted for who they truly were. Something huge was waiting, but it wasn't the dramatic surprise they had once imagined. The greatest surprise was discovering that real connection doesn't erase every challenge. Instead, it gives two people the strength to face life's uncertainties together. They understood that every difficult chapter, every delay, and every unanswered question had helped shape them into people capable of appreciating this moment with gratitude instead of taking it for granted. What once felt like a missed opportunity had quietly become perfect timing. As the evening slowly turned into night, they walked side by side beneath a sky filled with stars. There was no need to rush the future or make impossible promises. They simply enjoyed the peace of knowing they no longer had to wonder what might have happened if they had been brave enough to speak. They had spoken. They had listened. And they had discovered that honesty has a remarkable way of bringing light into places fear once occupied. Before they parted ways, one of them paused and looked back with a warm smile. "Thank you," they said. "Not because you changed who I am, but because you reminded me of the person I was always meant to be." Those words lingered in the quiet night long after they were spoken. It was a reminder that the people who touch our lives most deeply are not always the ones who rescue us. They are often the ones who inspire us to become our truest selves. And so the story came to its gentle conclusion, not with an ending, but with a beginning. The future remained unwritten, filled with ordinary days, shared laughter, unexpected challenges, and countless opportunities to choose kindness over fear. Whether their journey led to lasting love, lifelong friendship, or simply a cherished memory, one truth remained unchanged: authenticity had brought two hearts together in a way that appearances never could. As the first light of a new morning stretched across the horizon, they walked forward with peaceful hearts, no longer carrying regret, but hope. The greatest lesson of all was beautifully simple: your true style is never defined by what you wear, it is revealed by the kindness you show, the confidence you grow, and the honesty with which you live. And sometimes, the most unforgettable person you will ever meet is the one who inspires you to become the very best version of yourself. That was the real message hidden inside this story, and it was worth waiting until the very end.